Thank you, Mr. Middleton, for agreeing to be interviewed. We really appreciate this opportunity, especially in the recent years that Dozier Boys School has been in the headlines. But we just want to start out first and talk a little bit about your background. Could you tell us your name and the day you were born?
Sure. I'm Bryant E. Middleton. I was born in Miami, Florida on 12 April 1945. I'm a native Floridian.
Can you tell us a little bit about your family?
Well, I grew up in a rather large family. My mother and father were separated at an early time. He was a World War II veteran, came back from the Pacific. He had difficulty with alcohol, so he was coming and going on a regular basis. My mother was by all definitions today, she was a beautician, hairstylist, whatever you wish to call it. She owned two very large shops in the Miami area. She was not there very often. My sister and I were basically latchkey children. She would get up and go to work early in the morning. We'd go to school on our own. I would return home late in the afternoon, and there was a key under the mat. And that's how we let ourselves in. And we stayed alone until my mother got home, generally about 9 or 10 o'clock at night. It was not a very good life. Back in the 50s and 60s, I can recall coming home numerous times and having Florida Power and Light had turned the electricity off because my mother couldn't afford to pay the utility bill, or the water was turned off. And that was normal. And there were many times that my sister and my mother and I did not have enough to eat. We went to bed hungry quite frequently. And if it were not for my aunt, Virginia, and my Uncle Bob around the corner, which pretty much took care of us kids when my mother was trying to make ends meet. We did have loving grandparents up in Palm Beach. And actually, my great-grandmother was still alive. I heard some interesting stories about my great-grandfather, how he fought in the Civil War. It was very interesting. My great-grandfather built the very first hotel in Kissimmee, Orlando area.
Wow.
And we had a large family because we came together often for the holidays, always at grandmother's, of course, which made it so much better. Lots of food, lots of good friends. And my grandfather was an old-fashioned blacksmith. He built every single gate and metal fence over on West Palm Beach Island and on Jupiter Island. If you go by today, you will see a plaque with Henry Dorsey's name on it. Seventh generation Floridian. My grandparents and great-great-great-grandparents settled the state of Florida. So that's pretty much my childhood. I went to elementary school in Miami, Fairline Elementary. This was a school back in the 40s and 50s where teachers controlled students by slapping them in the face, pulling their hair, making them stand in the hallway, stand in the corner while they continued to teach classes. The educational system back at that time was not what it is today. It was rather brutal, and that was very typical in that period of time.
Did you face any of that strict disciplinarian attitudes of teachers?
Would you repeat the question?
I'm sorry. Did you have any experiences with that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I had a teacher, her name was Miss Horneye, and her means of teaching was that if she felt anybody was disruptive in the class, she would stop. She'd walk down to their desk, and she would just reach up with a full swing and slap you right across the face. And it happened to me on a number of occasions. And I believe that's why I don't have any hair today, because she pulled it all out. So yes, I did encounter that. There were a number of other teachers, a Mrs. Dean, who was somewhat friendly, but whenever she wanted you to go down to the principal's office, Mrs. I've never forgotten the woman's name until just now. But anyway, you would have to go down. Cornelison. Mrs. Cornelison was the principal. But Mrs. Dean would sort of push you down the hallway, and from either the back of your head or the back of your shoulders until you got there. We had one male teacher, Mr. Lasher, who was about 6'2" and about 400 pounds.
Oh, wow.
And everybody was quite afraid of Mr. Lasher. And I will tell you that of all my years of education, from the first grade to finishing up a graduate degree, Mr. Lasher was by far the best teacher I ever had. So,
Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Mr. Lasher, as I said, about 6'2", about 400 pounds, rather gruff individual, but he made learning interesting. He did not do it in the sense of a rote manner. It wasn't page 1 says this, this, this. He would make it a competition, like with spelling or with history. He would put the boys against one wall, the girls against another, and then he would ask questions. And he would say, Bryant spelled the word delightful. I'm a terrible speller. I mean, it took me weeks to learn to spell. But he would go back and forth, and when it was all said and done, which team had ever the most amount of players left, for that week we were the winners. We got to do everything first. We got to go to the playground first. We got to go to the cafeteria first. And it was challenging and it was enjoyable because it was a learning phase done through competition, and you never wanted to be on the losing team. So it was very good. Mr. Lasher was a collector. He had a very large World War II collection and often invited the students over to look at his military collections. And it was quite enjoyable. Very good teacher. We need more like Mr. Lasher.
That's really nice. So, talking about your elementary school years and how they were a little difficult, what happened after that in middle school? How did you transition from that to middle school, and what happened afterwards?
Well, we called them junior high school, and I went to Kinloch Junior High School on Flagler Street in Miami, and the overcrowding in the school system at that time, they said, well, we're going to break it up, and they took a number of us who lived in a certain portion of the town and sent us to West Miami Junior High School. So I did the 7th, 8th, and 9th grade at West Miami, and with a break up to Mariana and back. And it too was a strict type school environment. Teachers mostly were male, had no problems of grabbing you by the front of your shirt or smacking you in the back of the head or pushing you or hitting you with a shoulder as you passed in the hallway. Mr. Silver, who was the physical education teacher, was a very strong authoritarian type individual, but when it came to sports, he too turned it into a team effort of competition, which made it enjoyable. And because I was a fast runner, there was only a couple of us that were on the track team and the football team, and it was enjoyable to some extent. But Mr. Fred, who was the dean of the school, and the shop teacher, they had a very stern policy that if you arrived even as the bell rang, if you were stepping into the door as the bell rang, you came over, leaned over the table, and with a wooden paddle, you got a good hard lick that said, "Don't be late again." I will tell you that I probably got 10 or 12 licks over the year, as did a couple of the other guys, because we would stand out in the halls with our girlfriends and talk and run our mouths and keep looking at the clock. So that was pretty typical.
So maybe we could transition to talking about Dozier.
Sure.
What was the reason you were sent?
Well, I wasn't sent to Dozier to begin with. I was sent to the Florida School for Boys at Mariana.
Yeah.
It was changed later to the name of Dozier in '68. An extremely contemptible individual. And why they would name streets after him and schools after him is just incomprehensible. I was sent to the Florida School for Boys at Mariana. My mother basically wanted to scare me straight, get me to stop running around with the guys that I was running around with, not doing homework, coming home late, being a typical smart-mouth teenager, if you will, of the 50s and 60s, or the 70s and 80s or whatever. I have 14 grandchildren, so I'm somewhat used to smart-mouth kids occasionally. But anyway, I went into the judge, sat down in his office with my mother, and the judge pretty much was a little stern, trying to give me the riot act, trying to scare me a little bit. And I was a typical, once again, smart-mouth individual. I was running with a group of guys. And he said, well, I looked at your record. You don't appear to be a bad child. I want you to go back home with your mother, behave yourself, go back to school. And I looked at the judge and I said, no. I have no intentions of going back home with her. I like it over here in the youth hall. The reason I liked it in the youth hall, which was the juvenile detention center, I was getting 3 hot meals a day. I was sleeping on a warm bed. I was able to take hot showers. The lights were always on. So it was a change up from what I had grown up with, and it was a better environment than being at home. So when I told the judge no, I didn't wish to go back home with her, he stood up, leaned across his desk, and said to me in a very gruff voice, he said, boy, he said, I got just the place for you. And I sort of shrugged it off, yeah, whatever. And I sat back down, and within about 10 minutes, somebody came over from the detention center, and they escorted me back over. And I really had never heard the word Mariana. I'd never heard the Florida School for Boys before. I went back over all, fluffed up, and hey, I'm going to be here, I'm going to eat hot food, and so on. And the boys asked me where was I going, and when I said I was going to Mariana, a goodly number of them just looked at me, almost turned white, and they said, I was in Mariana, I've been there, I'm going back there, and it's a terrible place. And I sort of got a little upset, a little scared at that point. And so that's where I was going. I was charged with breaking and entering. I'd been charged with joyriding in cars. I'd been truant from school, things of that nature. But when I got to Mariana, my charge at Mariana was just basically incorrigible. So 2 detectives drove me up to Mariana. Back in those days, in the late 50s, the latter part of the 50s, the early 60s, there were no turnpikes. There were no major roads to get to Mariana. It was old Highway 90 through all these country towns, and it was a full day and a half ride.
Wow.
So the day I checked into Florida School for Boys, walked into the administration building, and gave my records to the woman sitting behind the desk, and she reached under the desk and picked up an old ledger book, one that you would have seen back in the 50s that an accountant would put numbers into. Tossed it up on the desk, and she said, put your name in there. And I flipped through 30, 40, 50 pages before I found an empty space, and I wrote my name. And she said, write in there what you're here for. And I said to her, I said, I don't know why I'm here. And she looked at my records, and she said, write the word incorrigible. I simply said to her I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't know how to spell it. Her reply to me was, you're causing trouble already, aren't you, boy? And it went downhill very quickly after that.
What year was that?
That would have been, now this is confusing. Mm-hmm. I've been told 4 different dates now that I was there. 3 different dates by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and just recently Melissa Gomez from the Alligator got dates from Tallahassee that are once again different from the dates. I recall being there in the latter part of '59 or the very first part of 1960.
How old were you?
It would have been about 14.
Okay.
And I was just about the middle age for the average kids there. We had children there that were 6 and 7 and 8 years old, and the oldest children or young teenagers that we had there were 17. So if you can envision on the white side, the South Campus as it was called, we had an average of 500 to 700 children at one time, year-round, on that side of the campus. On the other side of the street was the black campus. It was called the Colored, and they too had roughly 700 children. The state of Florida had a school in Marianna that had, on average, between 1,000 to 1,400 children at one time, ranging in age from 6 to 17. And the children at the school, most of them were there because they were either former orphans, they were truant from school, they'd got caught smoking on the school grounds, things of that nature. And it ranged in that general area. Now, if you ask the residents of Marianna what the children were there for, they would tell you that they were criminals. They were the worst of the worst. Well, I never met, in my year and some odd months, I never met a single criminal at that place. There were young juveniles that were mischievous, excuse me, I can't pronounce the word now, but they were incorrigible. Maybe that might be the appropriate word. They were rowdy. We liked to play. We were teenagers and young kids, and we liked to play football and baseball and what we used to call steal the bacon or steal the flag. We did the things that most children did. But the discipline at the school was brutal. It was brutal. My very first day there, after I signed in, I was sent over to the director's office, Mr. R.L. Hatton. And it was my true induction into the school of brutality. This man was your typical, what you might imagine, an old 1940, 1950 juvenile director, prison guard, who walked around with a .38 revolver strapped on his hip. I guess that was to intimidate or keep those 6-year-old kids under control. That's why you needed the gun, I guess. And he told me, I was standing in line with 5 other guys. Some kid came running out of the building and said something to Mr. Hatton, and he pointed at me, and he said, "Hey, boy." And I think if I got called boy once while I was there, I got called boy 60,000 times. Every time he turned around, you were boy this or boy that. And he said, "Hey, boy," he said, "I want you to run out to the fields and bring me back." And he gave me the name of a boy. And Told him I didn't know how to do that, and he said, well, you go out this building, go between these, and you'll find a clay road. He said, you turn left on it. It was Posier Road, and dark red clay. And I ran out to the fields and told the boy out there, I said, would you tell so-and-so that Mr. Hatton wants to see him? And I started walking back up the road. Now, I had not eaten anything in a day and a half. They didn't stop to feed me or anything of that nature. I'm walking down this red clay road, and I see 3 blackberries growing on a barbed wire fence. And I stepped over the ditch and picked them, and I cleaned them the best way I could. And I stood there and ate those 3 blackberries, which I have never had a blackberry taste that good in my entire life. By the time I got back up to the director's office, Mr. Hatton was standing out front, and he started screaming at me. He said, did you go get so-and-so? And I said, yes, sir. He said, you went straight there and straight back? And I said, yes, sir. He said, did you stop anywhere? And at that moment, my heart started beating because I knew that I had stopped. And I said, yes, sir. I said, I picked some blackberries off the fence because I was hungry. Mr. Hatton, in the true sense of the matter, went berserk, screaming, hollering, a rage like you can't even imagine. And he reached over and grabbed me. He said, you're going to learn to do what you're told to do. He said, we're going to teach you right today. So he said, you stand there and don't you move. Now I'm scared. I'm really scared. My thought is, oh my God, what have I gotten into? What have I done? A few minutes later, a state car pulls up, dark black sedan, and this big guy gets out of it. He's about 6'4", 6'5", looked like he was about 290, probably could play linebacker for the Dolphins or something, just a huge guy. But the one thing I noticed immediately about him, that he had only one arm. But his arm was as big as my thigh. His arm was like that, huge. Big old huge thick neck on the guy, and he walked like he was angry about everything. He went in the building. A moment later, he came back out with Mr. Hatton. Mr. Hatton walked over and grabbed me by the back of the neck, stuck his hand down on the back of my pants, grabbed my belt, and pulled up on it, like he was going to give me a wedgie, if you will. Got me up on my toes, and they escorted me over to what is commonly recalled or referred to as the White House. It's a white cinder block building, no windows, no ventilation, and they took me inside of the building. It had a very distinct smell of must and odor and mold, and the dampness of it was chilling. I've said many times to other people that I literally could smell the fear in the building. It was an extremely intimidating place. They took me in, threw me on a bed in one room, because there's only 2 rooms down the hallway. And he said, you sit right there. And he and Mr. Tidwell, and I didn't know his name was Tidwell at the time. I didn't know that till a couple of days later. Pretty soon he stepped across the hallway, and he pointed at me and he said, come here, boy, get in here on this bed. I walked in the room. I looked at the bed, no sheets on the bed, but the mattress was filthy. It was, you could see where children had wet the bed. The stains were there. You could see blood marks. You could see stains of where somebody had vomited along the side of the wall. It was a frightening place to be. And he said, you grab that rail, and he said, if you let go of it, we're going to start over. I had no idea what he meant by we're going to start over, but I knew very quickly when I saw Mr. Tidwell reach up under the mattress and pull out a leather strap that was about that wide. It's about that long, reinforced with a piece of metal in between and a large handle on it. And he said to me in a very gruff tone of voice, "Put your face head down in that pillow and don't you move." Now, the pillow itself was filthier than the mattress. It smelled repulsive. And suddenly I heard a sound that I don't think I will ever forget. It sounded like a hissing sound. And pretty soon I got the very first lick with that paddle on my posterior. It was a burning, hot, searing pain that just absolutely startled me. And I turned my head and looked over, and here came the paddle again. And Mr. Hatton said, "You better keep your face in that pillow, boy," and got hit again. And that kept up. He hit me again and again and again and again for 30 times. A 280 or 290 pound grown man with a reinforced leather strap hit a child at the age of 14 with 30 licks, as hard as he could hit you, for simply eating 3 blackberries because I was hungry. And that was my introduction to the Florida School for Boys.
I know you had other experiences, but I was wondering if maybe you developed any relationships with some of the other boys who were there.
You didn't form friendships. You didn't form friendships because the turnover of the school was somewhat quick. Sometimes boys would run. You'd never see them again. They'd never come back. If they did come back, the 30 licks that I got was nothing. Any boy that ran got 100 licks. So you didn't build many friendships. You did have acquaintances, and the reason being that there was a pecking order at the school. New guys were at the bottom of the list, and you had to learn which guys were in charge. You had to learn which staff members were the most brutal. So you pretty much stayed to yourself. You kept your mouth shut. You did what you were told. And if you did violate some of the rules, you paid a dear price for it. So you may know 1 or 2 boys, and that was it. And you never could tell that we had a term up there. It was called puking. And it is the terminology used that when one boy runs to a staff member and tells on you. We called it puking. So you were very reluctant to be close to anybody, because I had an incident where I was walking up the road heading to my job, and I had only been there for a couple of weeks, and this was one boy that I thought I could trust. He was on the paint crew. And I said to him casually, "I'm scared. This place scares me." I said, "I just wish I could run away and never come back." That was enough to constitute getting me another beating. It's called talking about it. So the way the system works up there, that if another boy knows that another boy is going to do something, if he doesn't run and tell on him, or puke on him, if you will, then he's also subject to being taken down. So they use the fear within us. And they did that on a regular basis. They took our hope away from us. We had no hope. We had no hope of ever getting out of that place. They took our dignity away from us because we were not anything more than a servant of the staff, which primarily was predators. They were predators. There were a number of pedophiles there, and they had an entire campus to pick from whenever they wanted. So this boy ran and said, "Hey, Bryant Middleton's talking about running away." That got me 56 licks with the paddle. And this was the time that Mr. Dozier was there. Mr. Dozier stood in the hallway with Mr. Hatton and Mr. Tidwell, and every time that Mr. Tidwell hit me with the paddle, he would slap the side of the wall, and he'd say, "Another, another, another." And every time that Mr. Dozier, the school superintendent, hit that wall, Mr. Tidwell hit me. So I passed out right around 56 or 57, and I was counting them. The next thing I knew, I was sitting across the hallway on the bed up against the wall. When I sort of shook my head and woke up, there was another child sitting on the bed. He had the look of total fear on his face. His eyes were as large as a saucer, scared to death. And Mr. Hatton stepped in the door, pointed at him and said, "You boy, come here." And he knew that he was going to get what he had heard me getting. And I will tell you, I cried, I screamed, I begged, I asked for my mother. "Oh, God, help me. Please stop. I'm sorry. I won't ever do it again. I promise." But the more that you screamed, the more that you cried, the more that you begged, the more enjoyment they got out of it. The more that they would hit you, and they'd hit you harder. And there was somebody always screaming, "Shut up, shut up." So I don't know of a single man or child at that point in time. Young children got the same thing that the older children got. They went into the building at the age of 6 and 7. They got the same beatings as we 14, 15, 16-year-old boys did. And I went down to that building 6 different times. 2 for talking about running, 1 time for eating 3 little blackberries, 1 time because I couldn't pronounce a teacher's name to his satisfaction, 1 time because I had poor grades, and that was typical. You could be sent down there for humming, whistling, stepping on the grass, any type of infraction, not making your bed well enough. And that's what it was like. That's what that school was like.
How did you negotiate the process of learning how the system there worked? Because
there was no negotiating of anything. You were a child. You were a ward of the state. You did what the state told you to do. And as Mr. Tidwell said in his 5-hour deposition, I, in fact, was sitting across the table from Mr. Tidwell, the man that had brutalized me for so many months and over that year's period. Now I'm a grown man. I'm a combat veteran. I'm an Army Ranger. I'm a U.S. Army officer. Sitting across the table from one of the most brutal, vindictive, mean people. And I'm within arm's length of him. I could have actually leaned over and touched him. And he said very clearly, he said, "The state of Florida told us to do it. The state of Florida condoned what we did to you people." That's in his deposition. So that's what it was like. There was no negotiating. You learned through trial and error. There was no book handed to you when you walked in. Nobody said, "Here, these are the rules, learn them." You learn the rules by a boy saying, "Hey, don't do that." You learn the rules by a staff member running up to you and screaming in your face, "I'm going to write you up. I'm going to give you a DR, disciplinary report. I'm going to send you down." That's how you learn the rules. There were no rules written or printed or on any bulletin board or anything else. You learned by making mistakes and paying for them.
Can you tell me what daily life was like? When you woke up, what you did, and what that sort of experience was like?
Sure. Well, the morning started very early, right around 5 o'clock. They would come into the dorm screaming like drill sergeants, "Get out of the bed, get up, get up." And all the boys would hurriedly get up, and we had a process that every morning you stripped your bed. On the mattress itself, there was a large black letter X in one corner. So what happened is on Monday through Friday, you flipped the bed. Other boys would come along and check to make sure that the X was in the position it was supposed to be. On Sundays, you flipped it the other way, and you started the process all over again. You made your bed, you went in, you brushed your teeth, you very quickly got dressed, you ran outside, and you sat at what we called the position of attention on the edge of on the wooden desk or whatever they were referred to as benches. And we sat like this until everybody came outside and until the cottage father would come outside. My cottage father was Mr. Hagan. And it is my belief, of all the staff members that I ever met at that school, bar none, Mr. Hagan was by far the most evil, mean individual that I'd ever met at the school. Meaner than Mr. Hatton, meaner than Dozier, meaner than Tidwell. I try to envision that. This man was about 6'1", about 125 pounds, jet black hair. He greased it down and combed it straight back. He wore dark black-rimmed glasses and was always looking over the top of his glasses with this, what you would refer to as your old, evil Southern manner. And he always had his hand down in the front of his pants, between his shirt and his belt. Always walked around like that and smoked Pall Malls. He'd come out after we all were out there. He'd get up and get in a chair. He'd reach over and he'd take a cigarette out of his Pall Mall pack and he'd tap it. There were no filters on cigarettes back then. It was two open-end tobacco portions. He'd tap it, he'd turn it around, smell it under his nose, and then he would hold it up and he'd say, "I'll bet you want one of these, don't you? I bet you want one of these, wouldn't you?" And you're sitting there at the position of attention thinking, "Oh my God, another day with this guy, another day in Mariana. When will this end? When will this stop?" And then he'd take the cigarette, put it in his mouth, and he'd light it. He'd take a great big draw out of it, and then he'd go right in the direction of the boys. And all you could do was sit there. And then he'd get up and walk up and down the line looking at us with the smell of tobacco on his breath. And he was looking for something wrong. Maybe your shirt wasn't on properly. Maybe your belt gig line wasn't straight. Maybe your shoes weren't polished to his standards. Maybe your clothes that you had weren't clean enough. And all he had to do was find one thing wrong, and that was a demerit. And the demerit system, you started off as a rookie, you went on up to pioneer, you went up to explorer, you went up to pilot, you went up to ace, and ace was the highest rating you could get. Anybody who made ace generally made it because of being a snitch, a puke. So a simple infraction, your shoe wasn't tied correctly, was a demerit, which means that if you got a demerit at the end of the week, you went down one grade, and you had to start all over again. So we would get up about 5 o'clock in the morning, start that routine. Then the bugle would blow, and everybody had to stand at position of attention and salute in the direction of the American flag. And we'd fall into a formation, and we would walk very quickly in a military-type formation to the mess hall. And we'd go into the mess hall, you'd get your food. Nobody talked. If you talked, you got in trouble. I know a guy that got a beating in the White House simply because the kid next to him gave him his pancake because he didn't want it, and he ate it. I know a boy who got a beating because he dropped a pat of butter on the floor and picked it up, and his cottage father saw it and accused him of stealing. So you stayed in the mess hall, you ate, nobody talked, you left, and they actually had other older children who walked around watching what you were doing at the table. And if they saw you doing something wrong, if there was an infraction, if you were taking this or taking that or talking, they turned you in. You got a demerit. You very quickly hurried back to the cottage, and they had a system whereby one day you would work at your work job, the next day you would work, the next day you would go to school. So it alternated. About 3 days in school and 3 days at work, and then you would have Sunday off, and you were required mandatorily to go to church services, where we had some very interesting priests. Yeah, we had some very interesting priests and pastors there that were part of the group. So now I worked in the kitchen crew. My day started at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I had to get out of bed, and we had roughly about 1 minute to get dressed, get our brogans on, our kitchen whites, grab a big heavy military jacket to walk at 4 o'clock in the morning to the mess hall. And believe it or not, in Northwest Florida, it gets pretty cold in the morning. So we get to the kitchen at about 4 o'clock. We would start preparing the morning meal for the staff and for the 700 boys. And then once that was over, we'd fed everybody, we then had to clean the kitchen. Now, I was the pantry boy. I was the guy in charge of the keys to the dairy section that had all the refrigerated milks and butter and eggs and things of that nature. And across the hall, I had the keys to the dry goods, everything that you can think of, rice and grits and canned goods and so on. So we'd clean the kitchen and immediately start prepping for the noon meal. And we would do that, feed them, then the dinner meal. And then we would finish up right around 11:30 at night, keeping in mind we'd been there since 4 o'clock in the morning as children, 14, 15-year-old children working 15, 16, 18-hour days, hard manual labor. And then we'd start trudging back to the cottage. We took off our dirty whites, and we put on our nightgown. We didn't have pajamas, we had nightgowns, and we went back to bed. We'd get up the next morning, and that would be our day to go to school. Now, having only about 4 hours of sleep, as children, we'd go to the school, and most of us would sit at the school desk, and our heads would bob, and we'd try to stay awake, and the teachers would send us over to the auditorium to allow us to actually go over and sit and get some sleep. So my education while at that school was zero. Nothing. No testing, no reading, no writing, no arithmetic, no math whatsoever, because the teachers allowed the kitchen crew to sleep. The only sleep we ever really got was 4 or 5 hours. So when I asked the state of Florida about 3-4 years ago, I wrote, using the Freedom of Information Act, I asked for my academic records. I asked for my medical records. I asked for my dental records. I asked for any record that they had, disciplinary records, counseling records, anything whatsoever. The state of Florida said those records don't exist. We don't have any of those records, even though that's in violation of state and federal statutes, which requires them to keep those records for 100 years. They didn't have a single record on a single boy that ever went through that place. And I know they're lying because I saw those records in November of 2008. But I'll tell you about that shortly. The day ended basically by us having some free time outside. We might play the game called Steal the Bacon. A group of guys would get on one end of the clay court, and other guys would get on the other end of the clay court. We'd put a tied up sock in the middle of the field, and the teams would go back and forth to see who could grab the bacon, the sock, get back to your lines without getting touched. That was basically our only recreation. Now, a lot of us would go out and work with the weights. We'd pump iron all day or all night. It was the only way of getting rid of the fear and frustration. Plus, it also helped if you bulked up, you got a little bit bigger. That meant that fewer guys were going to pick on you. So that was part of the process. And that was the daily routine. And it went on like that every single day. There was never any break. And that's the way that it was every single day.
You mentioned church services. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Church services were conducted on Sundays for the Christian students, those that were Baptist, Protestant, Presbyterian. They would go to church. And those of us that were Catholic, we went to Wednesday night Mass. And the church services were very simple. You got into a formation, you marched down there, you sat in the chairs, the benches, you were lectured by whatever denomination was lecturing that day, and there might be a little singing, you might sing a verse of something, and then you were brought back to the cottage. Those of us that were Catholic, we would go down there. We had a priest that you might envision him being someplace like Boston, someplace like Ireland would be a good place where he would have fit in. He was very, very gruff, very mean, not the kind of priest that you would want to go and give a confession to, because you just had this gut feeling that if you told him that you'd done something wrong, even though he had taken vows not to repeat it, you just had this gut feeling that he would go straight to Mr. Hatton or straight to Mr. Dozier with it. And he always liked to bring you up into his office. He'd pick a boy out and he'd say, I want to see you Tuesday at 1 o'clock in my office privately. And most of us found reasons not to be there. There were certain rumors that were going around that you didn't want to be alone with the priest. So that's the kind of religious services we had. Those that you really didn't want to go to because there was no connection to God anywhere on that campus. God had forgotten us there. God would not have put children into an environment with pedophiles and predators that came and got you late at night out of the dorms and took you various places. Yeah, there was no God there.
You were mentioning too, your job, but what were other forms of labor that children, I guess, were assigned to do?
Every child that was there had a job. No child was able to be there without being in a job. And the jobs consisted of everything. Anything that school had in the way of food or meat or dairy or wheat products was raised by the children. You could go over to the black side, which I did on a regular basis being the pantry guy, and you could go over to the butcher shop and you would find 7- and 8-year-old children with very large knives cutting up meat, running them through the saw. You would find children out working in the hot sun in the fields, hoeing and raking up the potatoes and bringing in the vegetables. You would find kids over at the dairy that were milking the cows, out slopping the pigs. Anything that entailed that needed to be done at that school, working in the laundry room, around hot scalding pans filled with bubbling water to clean the whites and the other clothes, the tailor shop, the paint shop, the storerooms, all of that was manned by children. Every child worked in those environments. And it didn't matter what your age was. You walked in, you were assigned a job, and that's the job you did for the time that you were there. You might be 9 years old, out in the hot summer sun of Florida, in the fields, raking and hoeing up the products out there and saying to the man in charge who stood around and watched you under the shade tree, "Boss, can I get some water? Boss, can I go to the bathroom?" It's pretty tough on a young 6-year-old or 7-year-old to live in that environment. Try to imagine a 10-year-old child in a butcher shop with a bandsaw running through meat through that bandsaw to cut the bones. How careless that must have been. How dangerous it must have been. They farmed out children, lease lend program. They might decide that there was a local farmer that needed the help of a few boys, and they would send them out to these varying places. And there is one case in particular where a young boy at about 7 years of age was sent out under the lease lend program, which is totally illegal. He came back the next day so badly beaten that he died that night. So those are the type of things that the children had to endure while there. I'm a military officer. I'm a U.S. Army Ranger. We do not lie. We do not cheat. We do not steal. And I will not tolerate anybody who does. So if you have a question, you ask me.
Okay.
And I'll give you an honest answer.
Okay.
All right?
Okay. All right. Are we ready? Yeah. Okay. While you were talking, I had 2 different questions come
Sure.
up. And one of them is about what segregation was like at the school and whether that was involved in the different types of labor that children were assigned to do.
The school, when I was there, was broken into 2 sections. Colored boys were on one side of the street. We white boys were on the other side of the street. The labor was identical for both sides. There was no difference. White boys worked out in the hot fields. Black boys worked out in the hot fields. We had kitchens, they had kitchens. So everything that went on either side was the same. The only difference being is that on the north campus, which was the black campus, they had the meat and the dairy. They're the ones that did all the chopping and cutting of the meats. And they're the ones that put the dairy products together, that milk the cows and put them in the big heavy metal cans. Now, I am probably only one of about 5 guys that I know that was allowed to get into what we called a tug. It's a little vehicle. You've seen them 100 times. If you've been at an airport, they're the ones that pull the planes around or bring your luggage out to the airplanes. Well, we had tugs like that with little tiny trailers, and I would go across the street and go to the dairy and go to the meat, and they'd put it in the trailer, and I'd come back. So my observation is that they conducted the same type of work that we did. Now, had I gone across the street with that tug to pick up the products, and if I had even looked at a black child, had I even nodded at him like that, had I spoken to one, both of us would have been at the White House in about 5 minutes. That was one of the golden rules. You never spoke to a black person while you were there, especially as a white boy. But we all did the same work.
I have one more question, and that was whether or not you were able to keep in contact with your family while you were there.
My mother did come up one time. She drove up from Miami. She was allowed to stay with me for about 4 hours. And my mother was a very observant individual. She could see things that she felt in her stomach and in her heart were wrong. She couldn't put it to words what she thought, but she asked me, "What's going on here? Why is everybody acting the way they're acting?" And I told my mother a little bit. We had been threatened repeatedly about talking about anything that went on at that school. The day you got there, the day you left, you were threatened about that. And I'll give you some details about some of those threats. But my mother stayed there for about 4 hours, and it was a fairly good time, but I knew that she was coming and she was going to be gone in 4 hours. She had brought my sister with her, and she told me, she said, "I'm going over and talk to Mr. Hatton, and I'm going to go over and talk to Mr. Dozier about what you've just told me." And that in itself was utter fear. A knot was in my stomach, and I told my mother, I begged my mother, "Please, please, please, please don't say anything. Please don't." I said, "I'll get in so much trouble." And she said, "Well, someday you'll come home, and then we'll take care of it." If she had said a single thing to Mr. Dozier, I probably would have been buried over on Boot Hill. I might be buried someplace out in an unmarked grave like all the other children. So, yeah, that was the only contact I ever had. A little over a year, I saw her for 4 hours, and that was it. Some children never saw their parents. And some parents never saw their children ever again, too. They disappeared.
I had a question too. I thought about before when you were talking about being sent to the boys' school. How did your mother react to that, and how did she react when she went and saw you?
My mother was very disappointed in me because she thought that she was going to take me over to the Judge Colberth, and felt that the judge would, as a friend to the family, would scare me and make me behave myself. And when I told the judge I didn't want to go home, my mother got up and left. And when they escorted me out and over to the youth hall, she was standing in the hallway talking to the judge, and she was crying. The day that she came up and spent 4 hours with me, the day she left, she was crying. And it made me feel pretty bad. It made me feel pretty bad that I'd made my mother cry. So that's how that went.
I'd really like to talk about what happened after you were there at the school. But before we get to that part of the interview, is there more that you'd like to have on record about what your experience was like there?
Well, I can just tell you that the things that I've said already are pretty much what happened on a regular basis, on a day-to-day basis. Every child was terrified. They physically, they mentally, they emotionally, and in some cases they sexually brutalized us. And I use that term not very loosely. They brutalized us. There was a individual, his name was Robert Curry. He was supposed to be a child psychologist. And come to find out, through whatever means, that he had never even finished college. He had never had any psychology classes. He was not a child psychologist. He stayed at that school for close to 18 years before they fired him. This man would come down to the cottages at night while we boys were showering. And he'd step around, he'd look in the stall, and he'd point to one boy. Let's use me, because he did that with me a couple times. He would say, "Bryant, come here." And you'd step out of the shower. Obviously you're nude, soaking wet. And he would stand there and look at you. He'd look up and down at you. Sometimes he'd reach over and touch your face and say, "How are you doing today?" Run his fingers through your hair, walk around behind you, spend a few minutes looking at you from the back, walk back around, and he always loved to touch. Always loved to touch the boys. In Troy Tidwell's deposition, a sworn deposition, Tidwell admits that this happened on a regular basis, and that the cottage fathers had asked him repeatedly to stop coming down to the cottages, stop touching these children. And that's in his deposition. A state employee under oath with a stenographer and with cameras rolling testified that they told Mr. Curry not to do that. The interviews that he conducted in his office privately consisted of questions of, how many times did you have intercourse with your mother? How often did you and your sister do it? Do you and your brother do it? And those are the type of questions that were asked of 6, and 7, and 10-year-old children. So, yeah, there was a lot of predators there, a lot of pedophiles that loved to touch children, who loved to come down to the cottages late at night into the dorms and pick out a child. There's one man that has given a sworn deposition to the FDLE that a particular employee would come down and get him 2 and 3 times a week and take him into what was referred to as the rape room. And this young man at that time was 12 years old. And the things that he has given under sworn oath would make the hair on the back of your neck curl up, would make you sick to your stomach. So those are the type of things that we endured as well. And it was not very nice. The day that I left there, I went into the barber shop to get a haircut. And back then, getting your hair blocked was considered to be sort of rock and roll-ish, if you will, for the 50s and 60s. Mr. Hagan came in, saw that the barber, which is another boy, had blocked the back of my hair, and screamed real loud, saying, "You can't have your hair cut like that. It's not regulation." He told the other boy, he said, "You cut that boy's hair right." And I told the boy, I said, "Don't you touch me with that." I turned to Mr. Hagan. I said, I'm not afraid of you anymore. I'm going home. Mr. Hagan looked at me. He said, how would you like to stay here and never be heard from again? And before I had opened my mouth and said another word, the boy very quickly took the razor, cut the back of my hair. Mr. Hagan turned and walked out, and he said, boy, he said, I'm going to be right here waiting for you when you come back. That scared me. That scared me. When the two state employees at about 9 o'clock at night were taking me downtown to the bus station, they pulled off the road. One of them leaned over the back seat and he said, let me tell you something real quick. He said, if you tell anybody about what went on here, he said, when you come back, we'll take care of you. Took me to the bus station, walked me inside. He said, your bus is number such and such. Get on it and don't be late. Didn't have a penny in my pocket. I was about ready to do about a 19-hour ride on a bus to Miami with no money. Not a penny in my pocket. So when I got home, when I left Mariana, I was meaner, I was madder, I was angry, and I was rebellious. I was worse when I left there than when I got there. And I resented authority. I resented anybody who told me anything that I didn't want to do. And I had a lot of difficulty adjusting back into civilian life, back into regular life. And many of my teachers gave me a lot of grief about it. I was not allowed by certain parents to associate with their daughters. I wasn't allowed to go to certain high school parties because I was one of them. And my life was pretty miserable, more so after I got out. And it's a life that is still lingering, still hurting me. And I go to some of the reunions and I see some of these men, and when these men hurt, I hurt. Because the state of Florida isn't willing to even admit that this went on. Even though that school was opened for 111 years, even though a governor went up there and saw how bad it was and came back and did a media report and then went back to work and didn't do anything about it. Dr. Eugene Byrd went and testified before a committee in the United States Congress and told them about what was going on. And nobody did anything. The Department of Justice has come down to that school on 3 different occasions, and the Department of Justice has never done a single thing about it. Brutality, beatings, rapes, deaths, and the United States government doesn't care. But let some black person get shot over in Ferguson, and there's an uproar. But yet, we've got 162 people that can't be accounted for. We've just dug up 55 unmarked graves, and nobody cares. Nobody cares. These were children. These weren't men. These weren't criminals. These were children. Some child of a mother was thrown in an unmarked grave, never accounted for again. The mothers, the fathers, the aunts, the uncles, the siblings never knew what happened to those children. They sent a casket to Philadelphia that Dr. Kimberly and the law enforcement people went up there and dug up the casket and opened it up, and it was filled with trash. The state of Florida sent an empty casket back to a mother, claiming that your child is in that casket, and it was filled with scrap wood and trash. Where's that body at? Where's that child at? Where are the other children at? And why does nobody care?
Well, I had a question I was going to say for later, but I think now is a good time to ask it. I was just wondering about, obviously these graveyards have been a large source of contention between the state and individuals like Dr. Kimmerly and the USF team, and then people like Ms. Ovell Crow and another family who've been really want their family's remains back. How do you think the state has handled identifying graves and bodies?
Very poorly. They, at first, fought us tooth and nail. They went into the court systems and they said, denied, 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 which is a word that the state of Florida uses a lot. So it took a lot of pressure from various folks. It took a lot of us standing in front of the cameras and making requests before they relented and to begin to exhume the cemetery on the colored side. Now, there's still another cemetery out there on the white side, but nobody seems to be interested because I have a gut feeling that they don't want it found. Because if all of the news issues that have gone on, all of the people that have been involved, when they found 55 bodies on 5 acres, I can't imagine what it would be like if they began exhuming hundreds of bodies of dead children on the other side of the campus. Now, I found a location that I reported to certain individuals that I think I know where the white cemetery is. And I was warned by a very high-level individual within the state of Florida that the comment to me was, you better keep yourself out of Mariana. You hear me? So I don't think they want to know the rest. I think they're satisfied with the 500 unmarked graves with the bodies of children with buckshot in them, head trauma, missing bodies. I think they've had enough. But yet they're still not willing to even admit that it happened. They're not even willing to stand up and say, we're sorry. They're not even willing to acknowledge that.
I know you're really interested in, getting justice. How do you think is the best way for this justice to be handled by the state for survivors and families that have been affected by this?
Justice comes about when somebody admits that there's a crime. Justice comes about when the law enforcement agencies are given the details, given the mission to go forth and investigate those murderers, go forth and investigate the crimes, go forth and investigate the sexual abuse. That school's been in existence 111 years, and not one single state employee has ever been charged with a crime. And yet, there is a state employee who is the main perpetrator of the beatings and other crimes against children, who's alive. And the state of Florida lets him walk the street free. So how do you get justice when you can't get justice to inform or implement the laws? When justice turns a blind eye? When the state who dictates what they will do doesn't care if they do anything? Justice is like a fleeting dream. It just comes and goes. we will never get justice. We will never find those missing children that are still there. Keep in mind that if they found 55 unmarked graves with bodies of children, what are they going to find if they really start looking on the other 1,395 acres? What's out there? How many dead children are hoping that they'll be found, returned to their families? There is no justice now. I doubt there will be justice tomorrow. But we still want accountability of those children. They owe it to the children.
After you got out and you were still in school and you had gone back home, what happened next for you in your life?
Well, I returned to Miami, went back into junior high school, 9th grade. I got back in trouble again. And the only reason I got back in trouble is that I started running the streets again with my old friends, of which many of them had been to Mariana with me. In our neighborhood, within a 5-block radius, there were 8 of us that the police had basically swept off the streets and sent to Mariana. I went back before Judge Colberth. I was sitting in front of him with another young man. And Judge Colberth recognized the young man previously from times in his court. And he decided that in our best interest, that they wanted to take us off the street for the summer. And the judge said, I'm going to send you. Of course, my stomach got real tight when I heard that. He said, we're going to send you to the state reform school at Kendall, which was right in Miami. And an average stay at Kendall is 90 days. And it's just to get you off the streets to, so that you can't do anything during summer break. The young man sitting behind me started bawling and crying and whining, oh, please don't send me there. I've been there before. And I, without thinking, said to him, I said, Bob, I said, shut up. I said, thank God he's not sending us to Mariana. And the judge stopped. He leaned forward on his desk and he pointed at me. He said, what do you know about Mariana? Wow, what have I gotten myself into? And I just blatantly lied. I said, not a thing, sir. I just heard some people next door talking about it, and it sure sounded like a very bad place, and I don't want to go there. So I went to Mariana. I went to Kendall, and within 2 days of getting there, they could tell by my behavior that I was going to be somebody that could be trusted. I ended up being the cottage boy with the keys that opened up the little cells every day and let everybody out. They put us in little tiny 5-foot by 8-foot cells with just a bed and a number 10 can over in the corner. And if you had to go to the bathroom at night, no matter what you had to do, you did it in the can. Of course, it wasn't very pleasing to sleep in that environment, but that's what it was like for 90 days. You lived in an isolated little cell without a toilet, without a desk, without a place to wash, until they let you out of your little cage the next day. So I got out of there. The coach had said to me, he said, you're a pretty big sized guy for your age. He said, when you go to high school, he said, I'm going to write a letter to the coach over there. He said, I think you should play football. And I went to Carr Gables High School, and my very first year, my sophomore year, I played first string defensive right corner, and I just loved to hit people that came around my corner. I was pretty good at football. But because of the education system at Mariana, the time that I had spent at Kendall, the time that I'd spent in detention, I was about 2 years behind my peers. So guys that were graduating in the senior classes were guys that I'd gone to junior high school and elementary with. And at the beginning of my junior year, I just realized that, I couldn't do this any longer. I just couldn't be with what I considered to be young kids who had never been through what I had been through. And I walked down to the Army recruiting office one day in the post office building downtown. And I went into the Marine Corps office and said I wanted to join the Corps. The gunny sergeant said, "We don't take people who aren't high school graduates." Went to the Navy, went to the Air Force, and heard the same thing. I was walking down the hallway and I was thinking, now what? The young sergeant stepped out of the hallway. He said, "You've seen everybody else. Why don't you come in and see me?" And I walked in his office. He was very nice to me. He said, "Sit down. Let's talk." And he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to join the military." And he said, "Well, what do you want to do in the military?" And behind his desk was a picture of a bunch of paratroopers jumping out of an airplane. And I said, I want to do that. That started my Army career. I joined the Army as a private, high school dropout, a lengthy juvenile record. I spent 22 years in the United States Army. I was a United States Army Ranger. I had served on elite reconnaissance unit teams in Vietnam called LRRP, L-R-R-P. Google it sometime and you'll know what we did. And the day that I left the Army, though I was disabled, had been wounded numerous times, I've had 32 operations to put me back together again. I walked out the front gate. 22 years later, I was a commissioned officer. I had a very high security clearance. I had a master's degree. I've been married 48 years to the same woman, and I think it's because of her that I'm still here and not dead somewhere on a battlefield in Colombia or Southeast Asia somewhere, or in jail. So I am a father of 4 grown children. Each of them has a master's degree, whether they like it or not. Daddy didn't let them get into trouble. Daddy was very strict, and even to this day. My 46-year-old daughter said to me on the phone the other day, "Dad, you were really tough. You were really mean, but I love you dearly." I've got 14 grandchildren. So I must have done something right while in the military, because I had very choice assignments. I went to more schools than I know what to do. I have 40 diplomas hanging on my walls in my office, and I speak 3 languages now, and I'm very proud of what I've done, and that's why I do this, because somebody needs to stand up and be the tip of the spear and keep this going. The state of Florida needs to do what is right. They need to account for those children. We don't need a handout. We don't need anything but the truth. Justice. Justice for all. We the people. And I'll tell you right now, I am not what happened to me at Mariana. I am what I chose to become. I chose to become a productive citizen, a good father, a good grandfather, and I am proud that I'm a military officer. I'm proud that I'm an Army Ranger. I'm proud of everything that I've done, and I'm proud of my family. But I'm very upset and displeased with the state of Florida. And that is my story.
Should we ask you more questions?
More questions,
Can we
please.
ask you more questions? Okay, okay.
Sure, I'll take as many as you've got.
Okay. Was it after your career in the military that you started to become involved in this organizing effort to seek justice for survivors and victims
Yes.
at the school? And how did that happen?
Well, we had, the wife and I had traveled around the world. I mean, I have literally been around the world, literally, at least 4 times. And we had gotten out of the Army, decided that we wanted to live as far away from people as we could get. At least I did. We went to Cheyenne, Wyoming. Loved it up there. I'm a skier, I'm a hunter, and the wife hates the snow. Cheyenne's not the place to go if you don't like snow. So we moved to Colorado Springs, and I had been stationed at Fort Carson, Colorado as a commander. And just something was nagging at me about coming back home, back to Florida. I don't know what it was, but there was just something nagging me in the back of my mind that said I needed to go home. So 3 years later, we moved to Fort Walton Beach, the Destin area on the Gulf of Florida. Stayed there for about 20 years. And we pretty much had figured this is where, this is it for us. One morning, my wife and I were having breakfast, and she said to me, she said, "Have you ever heard of a place called Marianna?" It was like somebody had punched me in the stomach. And I said, "What about it?" And she said, "Oh my God, you need to read the story." I picked up the newspaper and I read the story about a guy named Roger Kaiser who had spent 15, 18 years of his life trying to expose Marianna for what it was. And I read the story. Even though I've had combat tours, even though I've jumped out of airplanes, even though I have a Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, Combat Infantry Badge, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry, it took me 2 days to stop crying. I literally cried for 2 days. My wife took me over to my doctor, a psychologist, and I sat in his office and cried for 4 straight hours over this because the memories were coming back. I was having flashbacks. And when all was said and done, and I could stop crying, I had been married 45 years at that point. And one of the hardest things I ever did was to sit with my wife and tell her for the first time about Marianna. In more detail than what I've told you folks. More graphic, more horror, more brutality than what I've mentioned here. My wife said to me, "You need to do something." So I got on the internet. I Googled Roger Kaiser. I found him up in Savannah, Georgia, and I called him on the phone. And that was the beginning of it. Roger Kaiser, Dick Colon, John Bonner, myself, went to Tallahassee. I believe it was February of '09. We stood on the Attorney General steps, did an interview with the media. What was the other guy's name? McCartney. And Cologne went over to the governor's office, gave them a petition. Roger and I went upstairs to the Attorney General's office, gave them a petition demanding that there be an investigation. Governor Christ told the FDLE, you will do an investigation. And that was the beginning of it. For 8 years now, I've been pushing with this. I have spoken with representatives from the legislature. I've spoken to U.S. senators. I've spoken before the media numerous times. Myself and 4 other guys submitted to taking polygraph examinations administered by the FDLE. All 5 of us passed. All 5 of us never knew each other. We were never there at the same time. We were never in the same cottages. We've never heard each other's stories. And all 5 of us passed the polygraph examination. Now, it started off where there was 5 of us. It multiplied to 10, to 30, to 100. There are now 700 plus men just like me that have come forward. There are thousands of men that have elected not to come forward. They don't want to go through what we're going through. They don't want their names dragged through the gutter again. And I will tell you, we moved to Gainesville because we no longer could live in Fort Walton Beach. There were people showing up in our neighborhood from Jackson County. I had one truck, a red truck, with a good old boy in his pickup truck and his John Deere baseball cap on, who followed me all over the city. We used to have police sitting out in our front yard, and I just could not do that, could not expose my wife and children to that. So we moved to Gainesville to get away from it. And here I am, deeply involved in it again. But this is a story that needs to be told. This is a dirty little secret the state of Florida has hidden for so many years. 111 years. It's time for it to stop. It's time for the state of Florida to stop brutalizing children. Stop building criminals, because that's exactly what they've done. They've taken a child, they've molded him into a criminal. The recidivism rate of Mariana was 88%. 88%. You go to a reunion, 80% of the men sitting at those reunions have been in and out of the system all their life. All their life. Because that's what they were taught. When they walked out of Mariana, they walked out like I did. Mean, angry, vindictive. And many of them served time in the prison system because of Mariana. It needs to stop. It's time.
Oh, I have a question.
Sure.
Obviously, what you do is courageous because, like you said, there are a lot of men who choose not to, identify themselves again for personal reasons. And I was just wondering, what was it like to share your story for the first time publicly? Because I'm sure that had to be an emotional decision.
Well, as an Army Ranger, we have a creed that we live by. And that is that we will leave no man behind. And the creed says that I, even though I be the lone survivor, will continue the fight to the Ranger objective. And I applied that to what I'm doing now. Even if I have to stand in front of cameras for the rest of my life, I'm going to tell this story until it stops. The first time I did it, it was mumbling and bumbling and stumbling and trying to put words together. But I had been taught to speak in the military as a commissioned officer. I've given classes. I've been working as a liaison officer with foreign governments. I've briefed general officers. I've briefed congressmen, vice president one time. So once I finally got it to the point where I knew that I needed to hone my story, I needed to get it correct, I needed to get away from the horror and the brutality that I've not mentioned here, it became easier. But it's only easy to the point that when I go home after this interview, I will sit for a couple of hours and dwell on it. And I will say, oh, why didn't I tell them about this? My wife will say, no, that's not a good thing. They don't need to hear that kind of stuff. So the first time it was difficult. It's difficult each time. Please understand that. Sitting here explaining to you the horrors that I endured as a child while a ward of the state is difficult. But multiplying me times 111 years, and there are a lot of children that are now men that have been harmed by the state of Florida. But the worst part of it is their families have endured the way that they made us. Many of these men are in their third, their fourth, their fifth marriages. Some of their children don't even talk to them. And this is what the state of Florida did to us. So the first time it was difficult. It's difficult every time. But this is a story that has to be told. And I guess I'm relatively good at telling the truth about this.
What do you think of locals' reactions in Jackson County and in Marianna to the publicity that's come around this?
Well, I've been back to Jackson County a dozen times. I was the only man that was standing in front of the school the day that it closed. Ben Montgomery from the Tampa Bay Times was there photographing me. The numerous times that I've gone back for interviews, the police know us. The police know me. I cannot pull into Jackson County and show up anywhere, even a gas station, that there doesn't, within 20 or 30 seconds, that a police officer is standing right next to me. I have been threatened. News reporters have been threatened. I will tell you that when this one particular person, I wish I could mention the individual's name, that said, you better stay out of Marianna, I believe that that was two things. I believe that it was an implied threat, and I believe it was a message for my own safety. Don't go back to Marianna. So the people in Marianna are extremely mad. You'll read some of the things on the internet that they write. They call us criminals. They call us scum. We're the worst of the worst that there ever was. We wouldn't be there if we weren't murderers and rapists. And I never met a single man to this day that was ever charged with a crime of murder, of rape, aggravated assault. I've never met a single one since I have been involved in this the last 8 years. Yes, I've met a lot of guys that were truant from school, a lot of guys that got caught smoking behind the gymnasium, a lot of guys that, joyriding in cars, a lot of guys that were incorrigible, ran away from home. Never met a murderer yet. I have a very good friend that's been in and out of the system 7 times. And he's never been involved in any of that. The people in Marianna hate us because we're telling the truth. We're telling the way that they brutalize children. We're telling them about children that disappeared. I gave the FDLE full descriptions of 2 people that I know that I worked with that literally vanished off the face of the earth the next day. And the FDLA said to me, well, give me their names. And I said, seriously? 50 some odd years later, you want me to remember a name? And I said, tell me the name of 10 people in your high school class. And the detective couldn't tell me 2. So I will tell you that I stay out of Jackson County. The other men know to stay out of Jackson County. It's not a very safe place to go. It's a very, very backward 1940 environment. They used to hang people there. Blacks were hung for no reason whatsoever. The Klan was very strong there, and may well be even today. It's not a place that a young lady or an individual young man would want to go for any type of vacation. The people, we've had people that have said to our attorneys, have said to Ben Montgomery, come up and see me, I'll tell you the truth, I'll tell you what I know. Yes, I'm tired of it, I've lived with it for so long, I want to get it off my chest. I know what happened. We go up there, and the people have changed their minds. They have said, I can't do it. They'll burn my barn down if I tell them. I might go missing. These are elderly women that have actually reached out to us, reached out to the media, but they're afraid. They're afraid. So it's not a place I'd like to go back to.
I have one more question.
Sure.
It's about your relationship with the White House boys and these 5 men and then the other men who have, come and joined you all. I was wondering how those men have helped you cope and how you've helped them cope with this situation, and just bringing back these memories, but also trying to get justice.
Initially, when we first came together, we had our very first reunion in Savannah, Georgia. There was a lot of excitement. You could feel the electricity in the air among the men that had shown up. We were excited. We really, truly felt that it was about time that somebody was going to listen. We truly felt that this was a cause that was going to bring the state of Florida to the table to talk and to bring justice for what we needed, for what had happened to us, the brutalization. 8 years later, it is nothing like that any longer. The men are tired. A lot of them have died waiting for justice. Their families are distraught because there is no justice. I no longer go to the reunions. I was the liaison between the attorneys and the men. If the attorneys wanted something conveyed to the men, they would ask me to do it. And many of my own brothers were angry at me because I was bringing the bad news. And that's all it's been. For 8 years, it's only been bad news. They have thrown every hurdle in front of us, made every denial that can be made. They've said the statutes of limitations. Though the statutes of limitations don't truly apply when it comes to murder, when you find a body with a gunshot wound, a child's head crushed in, there is no statute of limitation. on raping of children under the age of 12. So the mix of men have become angry, they've become bitter. Certain little groups have formed. Reminds me of high school all over again. Little clique here. If you're not in this clique, you're not in that one. You know, you're not part of it. And I truly feel sorry for a lot of these guys because they had the dreams that this was going to be finalized. Now, don't get me wrong. There were a couple of guys who said, oh, I want a paycheck for this. But the great majority of us, 98, 99% of us, we want justice. We want the truth. We want to know where these children are. We want to know where our records are at. I'd like to see my academic records. I want to see my medical records. I want to see my vocational records. I want to see what they reformed me into. I will tell you that the state of Florida didn't reform me into anything other than an angry, bitter person. And that's the way most of the other men are too as well. They're angry, they're bitter. In spite of the state of Florida, this is how I turned out. But I'm the exception. I'm the exception. This is why the attorneys asked me to do the things that they asked me to do. The men are tired, they're dying, they're angry, their children have lost hope, their families have lost hope. The state doesn't care. And neither do the citizens of the state of Florida. They just as soon turned a blind eye to it. I've lived here 3 years. Not one single time has there been a newscast on the TV about this story. Not once. There has not been one single story in the local paper. And we're 3 hours away from one of the most horrible places in the state of Florida. The largest reformatory with the most horrendous record of brutality is just 3 hours away, and this county here can't find a single page to put the news out there about it. That's terrible. That's terrible. Children murdered, children missing, children thrown in unmarked graves, children beaten, children sexually abused, and Alachua County can't find one single minute to put it in the newspaper? Shame on Alachua County. That's how a lot of us feel.
It's really understandable. Do you have anything else you want to say?
I guess I do have one more question about what you think.
You ask as many questions as you would like.
Okay. Given that you talked about outsiders who'd come in, the Department of Justice, and this record of different scandals that the school has had throughout its history, how do you think it remained open for 111 years? That's something I just haven't been able to wrap my mind around.
Well, I guess I could go down the road of a conspiracy theorist. I guess I could do that. But that's probably not the right way to approach this. I would say, personal opinion, I'm not repeating anything that I've heard or been told. You have to ask yourself in the back of your mind, what person, what group of people, what industry could have that much power to dictate to the Florida cabinet, to the governor, to the legislature, to knowingly and willingly condone that a school of this nature stays open for 111 years. Now, we have discovered that judges knew about this. Judges, in fact, were getting kickbacks for sending boys there. How does a school that has been investigated at the highest levels of our federal government still stay open? Why does a school of that nature for 111 years stay so private, so quiet, that nobody has heard about it? Nobody speaks about it. Nobody, even to this day, will admit that this happened at the highest level. Even though a Florida governor said if you knew your children were there, you'd be up there with guns to get your kids out. So my question is, who has that much authority to keep a place like that open? I can think of a few large vacation industries in the state of Florida that would have enough reasons to keep something like that quiet, wouldn't want to hurt their recreational areas. But this is speculation on my behalf. You know, maybe there's a large industry that deals in food products that doesn't want this out in the open. Maybe there's a large group of Native Americans in the state of Florida who don't want casinos bothered, don't want a reduction in tourists. Just speculation. Not that I've heard that before. So I don't have an answer for you, but whomever they are, they must be pretty powerful. Pretty powerful. So that's just speculation on my behalf, though.
Do you have anything else?
Yeah, I guess I have one more question.
One more?
Yeah, I keep saying
Again?
I've said that again and again.
Okay.
Yeah, my question would be what you'd like students or staff who are our age, who are listening, who are watching your interview, what do you think would be a valuable thing for them to take from your story and something they can do to help, or what would be a positive outcome for someone who feels compassion for what you're telling us?
That's somewhat of a rhetorical question. I think one that you could answer yourself. I believe that were I given the opportunity to speak to a large group of young students, and I look at you two here, and you're young enough to be my granddaughters. I have a grandson that goes to Florida State. We don't even talk to him anymore. But what would I like the students to gain from this? I would guess I would like the students that are journalists, students that are historians, are future historians, people like you who are going to write history in the future, research history. I think I would like the law department students to understand that this type of thing goes on in our country. You know, you can sit down in front of the TV at night and watch the BBC. You can sit there and read Der Spiegel out of Germany. You can listen to folks from France, as I have. I've spoken with reporters from those places. Stories have been posted by things that I've said. The best that I would like the students to take away from this is this has to stop in our nation. This cannot happen again. And I'm not going to be here much longer. I realize that. you're looking at a person that in 15 or 20 years will be gone. Somebody has to pick up the guidon and carry this forward. And it may be you. You may be the next people that save a child from the brutality of the state of Florida. Maybe the law students coming out of the Levin School will be the next judges and the next lawyers. And maybe they will say, enough is enough. Maybe you as his historians will dig up more. You may be the next ones to expose the graveyards, to find other history of the state of Florida. This state is number one in the nation in the brutality of children. And it's time for it to stop. So you take away from it what you need to make this stop. That's what I want you to take. Save a child. Speak up. Don't put up with this. Don't go along and just don't be one of the crowd that just turns ahead and ignores it. Get the strength within yourself to stand up, stand out, and put a stop to it. It has to. No more dead children. No more missing children. No more sexually abused children. No more dead children. No more brutalized children. That's what you need to take away from this. Another question?
That was my last question.
You sure?
Yeah. Do you have anything else you want to add?
I think you need a break. I'm watching each of you, and I can tell this has been pretty intense for everybody, me as included. I have just barely scratched the surface since we've been here. There is so much more that I could tell you. So many things that I personally have reported to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, to the Attorney General, to the Governor, that no action's been taken on. We have pleaded with the Justice Department. We've pleaded with the FBI to investigate this, and they just simply go, We had a state legislator who voted against the bill that is sitting on the governor's desk. He voted against it simply because he said, that's ancient history that happened so long ago. This brutality stopped years ago. Well, it was still going on in 2008 when I was given access to the school, was allowed to go in and speak to the students. They told me in 2008, 2009 that, they were still being brutalized. They were still being brutalized. And that's ancient history, I guess. That was only 7, 8 years ago. And when I looked at the superintendent of the school, Mary Zazinski, and I looked her right in the face and I said, "Are you still beating children in the White House?" She went, "No." She said, "We don't do that anymore." She said, "We medicate them now." And that was her response. "No, we medicate them now." So, even to this day, you've got representatives who don't want to admit this, who voted against it. It's still sitting on the governor's desk. It's been there for over a week now. Why hasn't the governor signed the bill? Why hasn't he signed the bill that will help bury the children that have been identified through DNA? Why will he not sign that bill already? If I were the governor, that had come across my desk, and I had listened for 8 years to what went on there, I would have made that my #1 priority. And I would have made sure the media watched me sign that. But Governor Scott hadn't signed it yet. Why hasn't he signed it? You asked about the people, the powers, the people that may be influencing certain things from Jackson County to Orlando to Miami. I don't know. Maybe it's time that you ask them.
What is this specific bill that's on Governor Scott's desk?
Senator Joyner got a bill through the legislature saying that the state will provide up to $7,500 to help the families bury the remains of their children that never came home until now. The money will fund a possible memorial to be placed somewhere within in the state. And you have to excuse me for a minute. This is this has become personal at that point. The bill will help the families bury their children. Some of them that 100 years they didn't know where the children were. The parents have passed on, the grandparents have passed on, the aunts, the uncles, the brothers or sisters are gone. So now we've got the responsibility of second and third generation cousins who are going to accept a handful of bones to bury that child with dignity rather than being thrown in an unmarked grave. So that's what the bill is for, is to help those families give those children the dignity that they deserve, the dignity that they took away from us, our hope they took away from us. Well, we brought home those children. Those of us that stood up and fought this fight, we brought those children back to their parents. And there's more still out there. So the bill is to help do that. The bill is to hopefully build a small memorial that will remind anybody and everybody who sees it what these children endured while in the hands of the state of Florida. The terrible thing is these people at Mariana were our mentors. They were the people who were supposed to protect us, to care for us, to guard us against harm, to teach us, to train us, to send us back to Florida, to our parents, a better person. They failed every one of us. They failed you. They failed me. They failed my family. They failed thousands upon thousands and thousands of other children. The state of Florida failed all of us by allowing this, knowing this, clearly, fully documented, even as late as 2007 under a deposition by one of their own employees. The state of Florida has failed all of us. They made some of the children worse than what they ever were. And some children never were heard from again. Mothers went to bed wondering where their child was. Why? Why did they do that? Why did they condone it? Why did they allow it to happen? Fully well knowing that it was happening every single day. Now, you asked what should the students take away from it? I've given you a little bit, but what have I taken away from it? I know in my heart that right now, when I go to bed at night, I know because of everything that I have said and done, everything that I have sacrificed and put forth into this, I know that there are no children at that school anymore being brutalized. I know that in my heart. That's why I do this.
We really appreciate you coming to talk to us. I know this is not an easy thing for you to do, but
Are we off camera or are we still on camera? Well, that's okay. You leave it on if you want. That's probably as emotional as you will see me. But I do feel good knowing that the school is closed. If there's one thing that we got done, was that we got the school closed. There are no more children being abused, being harmed. So that just makes me feel good.
I can only imagine.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
It was my pleasure.